Hello, everyone, and welcome to the sixth podcast video in our series that we're calling Stories with Tony and Linda. In this, we follow the 7 Stories Bible study course from Bethany, and we are today focusing in on the 5th of the story cycles, which is called From Victim to Vindication. In this cycle, we look at the stories of Job and of Ruth, and we explore the concept of the innocent victim and the problem of innocent suffering and how the Bible tackles that. And then the final lesson in this cycle is on the book of Jonah and how Jesus identified with this unlikeliest and most unprepossessing of prophets. But before we do that, if Tony, perhaps you could, as before, give us a summary of the cycle as a whole.
Right. So in this cycle, this fifth story, we're dealing with the figure of the victim and the innocence of the victim. This has obviously occurred before in the stories of Genesis that we covered, and then in Second Isaiah, the suffering servant, things like that. But in this cycle, we focus on the not just the response to someone who is victimized, and stories of forgiveness or compassion, but the inner condition of the victim, what it means to be someone who's set aside, to be identified as the guilty party, and in some ways oppressed or even killed, and how the Bible tackles that, and it does so through, well, the way we're approaching it, through 3 really beautiful stories, wonderful stories, that of Job, of Ruth, the Moabitess, the woman, and then of Jonah in the Gospels used by Jesus, but understanding Jesus through the story of Jonah. So we're looking at three figures who are identifiable either as victim or someone who intervenes in the condition of the victim.
Mm-hmm. So also the role of the Redeemer.
That's right. So the one who intervenes is the Redeemer, and we'll be talking about that.
Okay. So the first lesson focuses on the book of Job, and Job is, of course, the quintessential innocent suffering victim in the Bible and, in fact, in world literature. Can you tell us a little bit more about the book of Job?
Well, I mean, Job is an incredible figure, and as Linda says, the literature of the book of Job is wonderful because it presents the argument and the complaint of somebody who is accounted guilty and therefore worthy of the sufferings that he's undergoing. In other words, these sufferings are something that he has merited by his sins. But he sustains an argument all the way through that he has done nothing wrong, that he's innocent, and this suffering is unexplained. And so the book announces the theme very powerfully of unexplained human suffering.
So this is a sort of a new thing, because up to this point, the Deuteronomic worldview has been dominant in that. If you're suffering, you must have done something to be responsible. There's a cause and effect there.
Right.
Whereas, so this book was written later, I'm assuming.
Right. So this book comes in directly, really, although it's never really understood that, or hasn't been understood that way, that it's actually a counter argument to the Deuteronomic position or the Deuteronomic worldview, which is that if you do wrong, God is going to punish you and punish you severely. So then the inference is in the human mind is, well, if something bad is happening to you, especially very bad, it's because you must have done something wrong and that it's your fault.
So this is a more sophisticated writing than what has come before.
Yeah. So the setting of the book of Job is before Israel. It doesn't mention Israel. It goes back in the midst of time, and so the traditional interpretation is that Job is a very ancient figure, and the writing must be ancient to go along with it. But no, because of the intensity and, shall we say, modernity of the argument that says, no, is it really true that someone who's suffering as badly as this must be guilty of something? Is questioning that quite severely. That this could not have happened until late on in the journey of Israel, and specifically after the exile, when they had suffered. And therefore, the theme of suffering rises to the surface as a theme in itself, going back also to second Isaiah and the suffering servant. So the idea of suffering, what is its nature, what is its meaning, comes late on in the story of Israel.
So can you tell us a little bit about just the frame story, what a summary of the book of Job, I guess.
Yeah, so to set up that question and to set up that complaint on the part of Job, you have what Linda has correctly noted as the frame story. And the frame story is, first of all, the righteousness of Job, that he doesn't sin. And then this kind of rivalry and competition that takes place in heaven between Satan and God as to whether Job really is righteous. Well, Satan says, and Satan at this point is not the traditional figure of Christian imagination, the great opponent of Christ and God. This is an official role in the court that Job has. Sorry, that Satan has. That is really like a police investigator. I mean, there's nothing more than that at that point. The Satan, the accuser, and he says, "Well, okay, just give me the opportunity, and I will show you just how righteous or unrighteous Job is." And so God says, "Okay, all right, you can take his stuff from him, i.e., his property and his children, but don't touch his body." And then Job still doesn't complain. He's righteous. And then Satan says again, "Well, if you let me hurt him personally, give him a very severe illness, then he will show how deep his righteousness really goes." And of course, then Job gets afflicted with a horrible illness, covering him in sores from head to foot, and he just sits on his dunghill, scraping his sores. And it's at that point that his complaint begins.
And the Satan disappears,
and the Satan disappears, having done his job, and in the place of the Satan, along come his three friends or counselors, and they're not really friends because they just sit there, first of all, and say nothing. They don't console him. And I think it's after 7 days, Job can't bear it any longer, and he just starts complaining. He doesn't curse God. He doesn't condemn God, but he does say on his own behalf, "This is not right. What's happening to me? I have done nothing." And the friends basically say, and they hinted it at first, but then become clearer as they go along, "Well, you must have done something.
Mm-hmm.
And if you would confess, then at least you'd get back on the right side of things, and you'd be good with God." But Job holds out, and that's the greatness of Job, is that and this greatness of the Bible is that it sustains this complaint and this protest literature that given the character of the suffering, I have done nothing to warrant this. And I want to understand I want to know why this is happening.
And even at the end of the book, God himself joins in at least at first, joins in the accusation,
Yeah.
or
really the the attempts to quell Job. I mean, it's amazing because you have these three friends who have three sets of speeches each. So you have basically nine speeches directed against Job, and each time he declares his innocence in response. And then we have some other strange figure called Elihu who comes along, and his name means he is God. So he's kind of like a stand-in for God. And then finally, God himself arrives from the whirlwind. You know, nobody can quell Job. Nobody can quench his protest. And then God comes along and basically yells at him.
Until the final chapter.
And then in the final chapter, so God says, "Look, I'm not going to answer your question, but I can tell you, you don't know anything." He says, "You know, okay, do you know how the stars get put in place? Do you know where the animals live? Do you know how I feed them?" He goes through all these kind of natural history kind of things and says, "You don't understand anything, and therefore, don't ask questions. Don't ask these questions." And then Job at the end, and traditionally in the answer he gives, is that he does submit to God, but his answer is highly ambiguous, and it can certainly and should be read as restating in kind of bleak form his complaint that he's made all along. And then in the very final chapter, as Linda says, God appears like in the beginning, that like it's the beginning and the end of the frame story of the encompassing narrative around the complaints of Job. God says, actually, Job is right. In the end, God declares Job is in the right and the friends are wrong, and they better go and ask Job to pray for them. Otherwise, they will be subject to God's wrath. So the whole thing in the last reel, the last kind of bit of the movie gets turned on its head. There's a wonderful twist in the tale, and God says, "No, Job is right." And that is not normally read. And I remember when I first heard that exposition that actually in the final chapter, God says Job is right. It was an astonishing thing because I was taught along with everybody else that Job did sin in some manner with his arrogance, his protest, not giving in. No, that takes away all the true drama and power of the book, which is this complaint about human suffering, unmerited human suffering, which to some degree all human beings go through. So it's a wonderful revelation of the situation and the condition of the victim.
It's like it's the semiotic shift that we're talking about here, that there is a protest against that prevailing Deuteronomic
very
understanding
very
of God,
powerfully,
of how God works,
yeah,
how the world works.
So you can see that the Bible is this very profound conversation. It's not a monolithic document that says there's one understanding of God and of humanity. It's all just laid on us in an authoritarian way. No, it's this developing discussion that reveals the human condition, and progressively with that, the depth of God's response to the human condition, and the victim and the Redeemer are a key component of that response.
So you mentioned Redeemer, and in the middle of the book of Job, Job does cry out for a witness and a Redeemer. It's a short passage, but can you tell us more about how this particular passage connects with the overall problem of innocent suffering?
Yeah, it's a wonderful passage in chapter 19 of Job, and we know it from, if you've ever listened to Handel's Messiah, I Know That My Redeemer Lives. It's quoting directly from Job. And in Job said, "Oh, that I had a witness and a redeemer." And the word that he's using, or the word that is implied, is goel in the Hebrew, and we'll come back to that very strongly in the story of Ruth. But he says, "I need somebody who's not either God or human, or either with God or with human beings." Like that kind of that kind of dynamic between those two, but someone who stands with both, that stands with the weakness and the suffering of human beings, and yet is also the presence of God in some way. So I need this Redeemer to stand by my side, and then I will live, and I will see God in the flesh, in on the earth. So it's a wonderfully powerful passage in the midst of this kind of abandonment that he's experiencing, and says, actually, somehow or other, this is all going to be reversed somehow.
And it hasn't got it. The author of Job doesn't have it down, but has a sense, a sort of instinctive sense that there is a solution out there, and it's something to do with this Redeemer figure.
Right. I mean, it's hugely prophetic. I mean, it breaks through the kind of tissue surface of reality, and says something new is needed, and it is the Redeemer, the Goel.
Yeah, and so this figure of the Redeemer, or the Goel, is also present in many of the Old Testament books. It was actually, the Goel was an important figure sociologically. It had a function in the ancient culture of the Middle East at that time. Can you first explain a little bit more about what that sociological role was?
Right. So we're going to move on to the second story in the cycle, and that's the story of Ruth, and that's all balanced, all pivots on this figure of the Goel, or the Redeemer. Now, in ancient pastoral or desert society, there was no police force or court of law. So if anything happened that was destructive to a member of the family, or a family, if they were attacked in any way, how are you going to get justice? So the institution of the Goel, actually, it means the next of kin. That's it. So the duty is to restore justice. It falls to the next of kin, the Goel, to either buy back somebody who's been enslaved or carried off into slavery by raiders, or if there's been an attack and someone killed, then to avenge that killing by a reciprocal killing. So that's the way. It's primitive. It's pre city culture. It belongs to kind of wild open space with basic tribal arrangements, but it preserves the life in some fashion of a member of the tribe, and doesn't let that life be taken away arbitrarily with no consequence. So the Goel is the next of kin, is your Redeemer. Someone's going to get life back for you in some fashion.
And it was also a way of perhaps controlling an escalation of violence. If everybody agreed with this system, then it's sort of an eye for an eye,
right?
As is the Old Testament,
Yeah, and the Bible knows that vengeance is dangerous, and it can be blind, it can be passionate and irrational, and so it actually sets up cities of refuge in the book of Deuteronomy for someone who's being pursued by the Goel. So if someone says, "Well, I didn't kill that person," they can take refuge in the city of refuge for a year until everything calms down. So these are arrangements within that early setting.
Yeah. So how does the Goel feature in the book of Ruth?
So Ruth is our next story, and is very beautiful because it tells of two women essentially, and how they are the agents of redemption in this story. They actually affect the work of the Goel, even though they're not directly the Goel, the Redeemer. And Ruth is a foreigner as well. So we have a foreigner who actually becomes the Redeemer. So it's a very powerful Old Testament story that prefigures all the New Testament stuff of the stranger and the foreigner. So Naomi is the original figure in the story. She marries a man and has two boys as children. And a famine occurs in the land of Judea, and they trek off to Moab, which is another country, another culture on the eastern side of the Jordan. And they get food there and they get a living there. But then ultimately, her husband and the two sons die. Now, when the sons had grown up in Moab, they had both taken wives, and one of whom was Ruth. And Naomi says to her two daughters-in-law, "Look, I've got to go back. There's nothing for me here anymore. I want to go back to my own town, which is Bethlehem, and I maybe be able to live there. But you have a right to stay here. I mean, you are from Moab, and you could get yourself husbands here." One of them does decide to stay, but Ruth says, "No, I'm going to go with you. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people." So there's this wonderful story of friendship and faithfulness and loyalty between Ruth and Naomi. Mm-hmm. And so Ruth takes on this character of covenant faithfulness and loyalty. This word is used of her. It's a classic word of the Old Testament about the character of God being faithful and loyal to his people. Now Ruth, who is the foreigner, the stranger, she she then shows covenant loyalty to Naomi, and she comes back to Judea, to Bethlehem, with her mother-in-law to try to find life again back there.
And so while she's there, they end up trying to survive. So Ruth gleans from the edges of the fields, just to pick the grain that was allotted to the poor. So she picks the grain at the edge of the field, and that field belongs to Boaz.
Boaz
was
a relative
of Naomi,
right?
Not the next of kin, but close.
Very close. So the story development then goes on once you've set up this drama of returning of these kind of basically food refugees returning to Bethlehem. Naomi tells Ruth to go and glean in the fields because they had the right to take the grain at the very edges according to the Deuteronomic law. She goes there and she's gleaning in the field of this man Boaz, and Boaz is very nice to her. He takes care of her. He makes sure that she's not harassed by other workers, and he protects her. And she goes home and tells Naomi that this is what happened, and she's very happy. She says, "Well, actually, Boaz is our relative. He's not the immediate next of kin, but he's very near. So, he could be our ticket to salvation." So at the end of the harvest, she basically tells Ruth to dress up and look her best and go to the threshing floor where everybody's having a party, which always happens at the end of the harvest. You have a party because you've got food for the winter, the next season. And she goes there and she finds occasion to sleep with Boaz. She carries out a kind of divine seduction in order to preserve. This is the overarching story, to preserve the life of the people in the family of Naomi in the name of Naomi's dead husband. And Boaz is aware of this, and when he understands what's happening, he's slightly drunk during the proceedings, but when he understands what's happening, he says, this act of faithfulness is greater than the first. He says, this is another act of covenant loyalty, because you are trying to be the redeemer for the family of Naomi's dead husband, which now runs the risk of dying out completely. So he then takes steps to establish that he has the right now, the kind of legal right, the official right of the Goel, the Redeemer, and indeed he marries Ruth, and they have a child, Obed, and this is the salvation literally the physical salvation of the family that was going to die. So you can see what the response to the Redeemer, to the victim here is to make the victim live. It's not just to protest, but to give life to the victim.
And Obed is actually the grandfather of David.
That's right.
So there's a direct link to the Davidic line through Ruth's act of faithfulness and redemption.
Mm-hmm. And so, of course, David is the ancestor in the genealogies, in the Gospels. David is the ancestor of Jesus. So Ruth is the ancestress of Jesus.
And so there is the theme of the Goel runs through the book of Ruth. The official Goel is Boaz,
right?
But Ruth is
the effective
Goel, and the one who puts everything in motion and brings about those results.
Right. Yeah.
And is the exemplar
through the only agency that she had as a woman. But I mean, it's at that point, and it's very precious to say that yes, she did have critical agency at this point to bring about the life of her people.
So now let's turn to Jesus. How does the figure of the Goel or the Redeemer connect to Jesus in the Gospels? It's not directly mentioned, but
no, Jesus is not directly called the Redeemer in the Gospels, but the way he works, what he does, is constantly and effectively the work of a Redeemer. When he's healing people,
it's restoring
they're restoring their life, and when he raises the dead, especially, he acts as the Redeemer of life of this dead person. So he is the full representation of the idea, the Old Testament idea of a Redeemer.
And of course, later on, the church very definitely embraced his role as Redeemer, as you said in the Handel's Messiah.
Right.
It's a
term, yeah.
But how did Jesus, if he didn't explicitly call himself or identify himself as Redeemer, how instead does he describe his role?
Well, in the story cycle, Victim to Vindication, we take note of something really important that Jesus says in his own regard, which gives us his identification as Redeemer, because he's asked for a sign, kind of like
give us a sign, Jesus.
Yeah,
you really are
like fire from heaven, or thunderstorm, or thunderstrike, or opening up an earthquake, or something like in the ground, something manifestly powerful that would show that he really is the Messiah. And he says the only sign that's going to be given to you is the sign of Jonah, and that's highly significant because Jonah is not a reputable character. He runs away from the command of God, and he basically wants to get out of doing what God wants him to do. And
what did God want him to do?
Well, okay, so we turn to the story of Jonah, which is an Old Testament story, and it's very ironic, and it's very sophisticated this way, because actually Jonah himself becomes a victim, but kind of like a willed victim. He wills himself into the role of a victim rather than do what God tells him to do. You know, he plays the victim card in his own way.
Because God is sending him to Nineveh, which was the den of iniquity, and violence.
Yeah, that's the story that God says to go up to Jonah. I go to Nineveh and preach to them. That's the last thing that Jonah wants to do.
Yeah, they're the enemy. They're the wicked city, and he does not want to interact with them. And he
runs in the opposite direction. He takes a ship going west, whereas they should be going east. But he goes west. This is this big storm. He's asleep in the boat. The captain says, "Wake up, pray to your God." And he said, and then Jonah says, "Well, actually, it's all my fault. Throw me in and be done with it, and the sea will become calm." So the sailors, who are terrified, they said, please don't punish us for this, God of the storm, but we're going to throw this guy in. And they do. And calm appears. The storm abates immediately. So he's correct. It's his fault. But God provides the big fish, the mighty fish, to swallow him. So God doesn't let that be the end of the story, but preserves his life for 3 days in the belly of the fish, and then finally the fish spews him up on the coastline in Nineveh, or however that is possible geographically. That's what happened. And Job then goes to Nineveh and preaches, and lo and behold, they repent, much to Jonah's annoyance, his extreme annoyance, that they should repent and therefore not be punished by God's wrath. Yeah. And he wants them to be destroyed. He wants Nineveh to be destroyed. That's his understanding of what a prophet does. It brings about the destruction of the enemy. But no, God says, "Am I not right to be merciful to this city with so many people, and not to mention the animals?" Mm-hmm. And in effect, and also because they had repented, the king said, "Every citizen shall shall give up their violence." It says explicitly they should give up their violence. So it's a story about giving up the imperial violence of the imperial city of Nineveh, and then being forgiven and saved. And Jonah, being a prophet of Israel, the story actually tells, yes, the prophet of Israel brings that message to the wicked city, but in the irony of the story, the beautiful irony, the actual prophet, the actual protagonist of the story didn't want to do it, but he does do it. And so then Jesus says, "I'm going to give you this sign." That's the sign I'm going to give you, the sign of Jonah.
Which is the forgiveness.
Which is the redemption, the possibility of redemption from death and from violence. Because Jonah is going to die. Is swallowed up in the sea.
And the sea was the symbol of violence itself.
Yeah, that's right.
In Jewish mythology, it's the place where the monsters live.
That's right.
And yet God sends one of those monsters,
yeah,
to save him.
To save him. So there's that. The victim of death and a violent death is going to be saved, and through that event, somehow the world itself would also turn from its violence, as in the story of Jonah. And so Jesus' use of the figure of Jonah uses the figure of the victim, in this case, as I said, a willed voluntary victim, to overturn death itself and the power of death, which is violence, to overturn those things which are prophesied in the story of Jonah. That's why, even though it's a story, it's also a prophecy, to overturn those things. And Jesus basically says, that is what I'm going to do. So he is the Redeemer in the senses of that we are all in danger of our lives. Our lives are in danger, threatened by the conditions of human existence. And we need a Redeemer, just as Job says, "Oh, that I had a witness, but I know that my Redeemer lives." Job cries out, and then we have the reality of in the Gospels of someone who enters into the condition of extreme violence, swallowed up by the monsters of violence, but then raised up by God in order to project and proclaim the message of nonviolence throughout the earth.
So I think that it's a very beautiful message in Jonah, that even Jonah as a representative of us, really, of resentful, passive-aggressive, angry, bitter, violent, not holding on to our own violence.
Yeah.
That's who Jonah was. And yet, even so, God still uses Jonah.
Right.
And to proclaim the overcoming, the transformation of all people, all violent people.
Beginning with that wicked city.
That God can act even in spite of ourselves.
Right.
That God's desire for our redemption is more than the human desire for ongoing violence,
right,
and not surrendering, not letting go of that.
Absolutely.
Violence.
So it's a wonderful, along with the whole arc from Job through to Jonah, it's a wonderful way of turning the whole human experience of being the victim, and very often the innocent victim of violence, turning it on its head and introducing something transformatively new into the human DNA, really, into our bloodstream, so that we can be different.
I know that traditionally the church has understood redemption, in the old way of paying a price for our sins so that we can then go to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
But how does the seven stories interpretation of God as our Redeemer differ from this?
Well, that brings in one other aspect, is that actually God's self is named as Redeemer, especially in second Isaiah. Behold, I am your Redeemer, I am with you, using that word Goel. So God becomes the next of kin with the duty to raise up to life his people. Um, and in church tradition, we've seen redemption as the redemption of our souls, and secondarily our bodies, by going to this other space of heaven where everything is perfect. In the meanwhile, Nineveh, unredeemed, wicked, evil Nineveh, still rules the earth. The imperial process and practice. But in fact, what redemption means is to overturn and save us from the human practice of violence and death. And so God as Redeemer through Jesus, that's what God is doing. So it's a different theology, even though it's rooted deeply in the tradition. And the meaning of the tradition, and the prophetic meaning of the books of the Bible and the gospel, we know that's what it means, but our attention has been misdirected elsewhere to a kind of heavenly hereafter. But actually, what this story is teaching us, the victim to vindication, is the overturning of our violent humanity into something wonderfully new.
So to bring life, the overall project of the Bible,
right,
is to bring life where there was death,
right,
and not pie in the sky when you die.
That's right. Yeah.
But life in all its fullness.
Yeah. And we think, well, that's kind of impossible. We can't do that. But whether you think it's possible or not, it doesn't change the meaning or the message of the Bible. The message of the Bible says, yes, it's possible, and that's the project.
Yeah,
and you should have the demand, the challenge is to have faith and to be like Job, to say, though everybody gangs up against me and tells me I'm wrong, I'm still crying out for a redeemer.
And the faithfulness
of Ruth. That's
so
right. Loyalty and faithfulness
to this message of life in all its fullness, and finally the overcoming of death itself through resurrection.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for being with us this time, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.
Thank you.